Hello, this is Richard Long of the Learning First Alliance. I am pleased to bring you this conversation with David Osher of AIR. One of the things that's brought you to Public Schools Week has been three ideas, but it's really more than that. Safe, equitable, engaging schools. And how do these concepts come together? You talk about codependency and interrelatedness. Talk about how these are really one word together.
These are not just one word together, but given our best sense of how the world works, given our best sense of how schools work, given our best sense of how teachers can teach and students can learn, these elements that we have concepts for and words are interdependent. Now, what tends to happen often is we tend to look for a single solution or a single factor. So we tend to treat them as if they are independent rather than interdependent, and that one is more important than the other, when ultimately you don't get the bread if you don't have the yeast, as well as the flour, as well as the water. And in this case here, you can't say which is more important, because ultimately, if you really want to have the bread, you need to have all those elements, and you also need in some way to bake it.
It's in your book that you've just actually come out with, where we talk about the science of learning. All of these things of safe, equitable, and engaging schools are really part of schools being a vessel for learning and development. How do these things mesh?
They mesh in both within our body and brain and mind. They also mesh in our interaction with other people, just as Rich, you and I are having this right now. They mesh in the spaces in which we interact with and work in: our schools, our workplaces, our homes, our communities. While we traditionally in the West have tended to try to separate the mind from the body, and while sometimes when people think about the brain as a computer, we tend to separate the computer from both the mind and the body. We operate in that wholeness, that no one element is ever not affecting the other elements. You know that when you come to school or work and you have a head cold, and how harder it is to think. You can see it with our students if they just have asthma, and what happens with the asthma and how it ends up affecting their ability to learn at a given point. We see it when teachers or students are at a level of fear, and how that part of their body takes off, and they end up having what Dan Golden once talked about as an emotional hijack, which is part of the body operating. And we can see it in terms of how the neural patterns work. We can also see it in terms of what chemicals are being secreted and which ones are not being secreted. And we can see it in terms of people's behavior, and then measure it, because we can watch people who are not focusing on their learning and not able to engage in learning because they are in an emotional hijack where they're needing to protect themselves. And I've just given you a few examples. We could also see it in wonderful spaces. We can see it when we smile at each other, or we smile at a baby and we feel closer. We can really see it when people in schools who feel trust from their principals and from their staff, if they're principals, and from families and from students, really are able to then be more adventurous and to take steps that lead to better education.
The other word that you mentioned in your title is the word creating. And I've heard you before talk about frequently in the school business, we take not only one word, but we also have in our minds one set of kids when we're trying to create this. What's the falseness of that?
I think it was Michael Fullen with Matt Miles, who wrote an article in 1992 in Ed Leadership. I may be wrong on the citation, where they talked about change as being a journey, not just an event. And they captured not just the nature of change, they captured the nature of development, of creating environments, of doing things that work for everybody. We oftentimes, because of our policy cycles, but also because of the fact that we have grown up in a dominant culture where people expect to see results quickly, we do interventions as if they are going to be transformative, when at best they can start a transformation that takes place over time and requires people to continue to participate and to be even more ready to do their work. And they do it in interaction and co-action with the changes that are taking place. And so what happens is creation is not just that first act. The political philosophers in a big word called architectonics, like architecture. It's not just about thinking about something, it's realizing that. And in this case, the realization is not just with Legos. It's not just with steel. It is with humans who are evolving. And so what we need are structures that are much more like what is now happening, where engineers and architects are producing structures that can really handle the dynamic effects of earthquakes, which are really part of the dynamism of our environment, so that they will not fall prey to what would happen if you really just treated the environment as if it was linear and flat and never changing.
This idea of realization, let's go through kind of a process here. I pick up your book, either the neuroscience book, which you've just come out with, or the Creating Safe, Equitable, Engaging Schools. What do I need to be doing to embody this philosophy, this thought process, this feeling process that you're outlining?
There are many key things, but let's start with what are the things that you both can and should do and are doable. The first piece is to both know that you are important, but you don't do this work alone. You do this work with others. And doing this work with others means not only engaging them and being engaged by them, but developing and sharing common visions and enhancing the vision by what your partners will end up adding. And before I go on, while I said that simply, the partner is not just find another administrator or find another teacher or even just find another school-based employee. It's also find young people. It's also find family members. It's also find community members, not only because you need their support in doing things, but you need their wisdom in terms of understanding what you need to do so that your idea that you are trying to realize is not something that just looks good on paper. It really works.
Some of this also is to that world capacity and being ready for these ideas. And again, you've articulated some of these before. It's General Bradley is sometimes given this quote that amateurs talk strategies, professionals talk logistics. What are the logistics that we professionals need to be sharing with others?
Yeah. Well, there is a model of change that I discovered when I came to education, which was a second career for me, even though I had been a dean before and I'd been a teacher before, but at a college and university level, when I came to K-12 education. And it was not connected to AIR at the time. It's called the Concerns-Based Adoption Model. And it was developed by the Southwest Educational Regional Labs that now are a part of AIR, I should say. But I fell in love with it because not only did it understand that change is a journey, is a process, and that people have different levels of motivation, but it also understood that people also have different levels of facility and technical ability to do something. And ultimately, when things start to move and be elaborated where teachers and family members can really commit to the work and do it well, it's at a point where not only do people think something is important, but at the same time, they see some way of doing it. and they see some way of doing it because they have the ability to do it. Let me give you an example that probably happened before I found that book. I had a contract that I led for the Department of Education in the 90s on supporting assistive technology. And you may recall that Bill Clinton's message in 1992 is it's the economy, stupid. The assistive technology that I was supporting is great stuff that the federal government had invested in that really we now benefit from in so many different ways. But the message of the center that I had, from my understanding of implementation, is it's about the logistics, stupid. Don't just give me a computer, give me a plug for that computer and make sure I know what to do so I can really do it simply, because otherwise, as Larry Cuban once showed, the computers that went into classrooms became nice settings for flowers. So it is the logistics, stupid, but that does not mean that it isn't strategy as well. And I think that Bradley understood that in reality, it's both. But just as there is an inextricable relationship between safe, engaging, equitable schools and environments, there is an inextricable link between strategy, its implementation through tactics, but also the tactics that have and tactical changes that have to be made in the moment and adaptive on the ground, and the ability of people who are leading the effort to understand that, and if necessary to modify what they're doing so that even though they're still realizing that same North Star, they're able to do it because of the fact that they're adjusting to new information.
How do we get this interpretation of North Stars and modeling of what to do versus the understanding of really how you adapt it to do it?
One of the things is that in that stage where you engage people, it's really important not just to decide what are the things that we feel are necessary and why do we want to do them, but to talk and really analyze how we do them and to try to anticipate what may very well be anticipatable consequences that we often don't think of, and therefore we say they were unanticipated. And they're sometimes unanticipated because we didn't ask the people on the ground the question about what might happen. Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with schools directly, but it just is the same in terms of schools. People sometimes in the medical field talk about the fact that families may not support their children in taking the medication that is prescribed at the right time. But if the clinician does not take the step to ask the parent, are they going to be home at that time? Is this a time where this can happen? Even a well-intended parent may not be able to do something. It's not necessarily just about intention. It is also about the right logistics. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't need parents to understand why it's important. We also need that as well. And that is why in other work I have been doing with colleagues at AR and colleagues outside of AR, like my colleague Gabe Wandersman, we talk about readiness as being a mathematical product, heuristically, of people's motivation and organization's sort of momentum, plus both the general capacity of the organization or the person to support something. If my bandwidth is low, I can't do things as a person no matter how smart I am. If the organization has good intentions and understands what it wants to do, but doesn't have systems to support what it needs, things won't happen. But also, it's the specific capacity to do certain things. So that if we want teachers to be able to be culturally responsive in their instruction, because we know that culturally responsive learning makes students safer, helps them engage in learning more, and it creates equity, we have to support the ability of teachers to be able to be not just culturally competent, understanding, but at a level of proficiency and behavioral attunement to students so that they can be a culturally responsive teacher.
These are very demanding skills and understanding. How do you envision our being able to do this with 22-year-olds graduating, just starting out, and like every other professional, not having the real skills in order to do their job?
Yeah. Ideally, in our grandchildren's generation, hoping that they are still around, people's preparation in school beforehand will make this a much more natural process because of the fact that people will have learned from that in their pre-service learning and in their general education in college or university, as well as in their high school and public school. That is not necessarily the case, which means that one really does have to provide sustained and very, very powerful ongoing professional development and support that I think really understands that change process that Omar Bradley talked about before. It really involves enabling people to confront the tough work in classrooms with help from others to help them think through the challenges in an environment where they feel safe enough to take risks so that they may make a mistake, but at the same time, there's also protections for the students so that if the teacher or the clinician does make a mistake, there are other ways of protecting the child, which in part benefits from the fact that if students feel a voice and can help respond and say how things are working, and if family members have an ability to communicate, they're part of that protective mechanism. So part of it involves ongoing professional development and support. But I want to go back to my point that I made much earlier about what happens when you and I smile at each other. I want to say this because of the fact that this is a theoretical right now. I think there's good theoretical and empirical grounds for what I'm about to say, that what we want to do is to create situations where teachers and students can be in such a greater level of attunement that will bond them together more so that they can learn from each other, so that they can communicate with each other. When I smile to you, it makes it easier for you to smile to me, which then reinforces my good feeling. When students feel that they can really express what they need as learners without being punished, and when they have a vocabulary that enables them to do it, and particularly if they can do it in a skillful way that is not off-putting, and when teachers are in a space where they have enough psychological energy and enough bandwidth so that they can really listen to individual students, these processes can happen. Now that's hard, but if we create conditions for learning in classrooms through universal activities and in schools through universal activities, we tend to do things that will start to minimize some of those distractions that get in the way. So it's partially being planful and providing ongoing professional development and support. It's partially knowing that biology and our human species' strong elements will support the process if we can open it up, but it also involves intentionally doing things at a school and district level universally that create the conditions where there are less problems in any moment within a classroom so that teachers can concentrate more and so that students can concentrate more. And that would have been the case 10 years ago. And that's going to be the case 10 years from now. But right now, that's even maybe, I wouldn't say more the case, but palpably the case that we need to create a safe universal environment in schools. We need to create an environment where everyone feels they have a shot at doing something if they put their effort in. We need to create an environment where people can engage in a learning process because they're both better engaging with each other, but it enables them to then get to the business of school, which is about learning and development, which can be very protein rich and emotionally satisfying to the people involved.
David, I think you've just summed it up very nicely and come back to the cooking metaphor, that all of those elements are in the creating. And it's also in the creation activity of the teacher in the school.
That's right. That's right. If I can use your cooking metaphor for a second, around 2005, I had the good fortune of studying the first generation of a very interesting program that I still work with and I'm partnering with in some ways, called Turnaround for Children. And they were doing work in middle schools in the South Bronx that were deeply troubled. And they were able, by building the capacity of the organization and providing coaching to leadership, to really start turning things around. But why I'm calling them out now is your cooking example, Rich, because the language that we heard from the principals on the ground that talked about how schools were changing, and what we saw through our qualitative work, was that the temperature in the schools was reduced. Sometimes you need to fire it up. Other times, if you want the cooking to go well, you got to reduce it. And what happened when the temperature that was reduced, to give you the example from one school, is schools where teachers had left the school on 1 year because they didn't feel they could teach. After another year, the same teachers wanted to come back and had reapplied because they had heard about the transformations that were happening. Okay, so I mean, sometimes you want to pump it up. Sometimes you want to tone it down.
And that's this flexibility and adaptation that you speak so often of.
And it's about creating and the ongoing creation. No, and there is so many public schools that I've seen do the things we're talking about under the right conditions.
And I think we need to be very mindful of those right conditions and stop emphasizing one thing will create the cascade of change.
Right.
It's all of it.
There is no silver bullet, and penicillin alone doesn't do it, even though we all know that vaccines and antibiotics are important.
Thank you, David Osher of AIR. This has been a marvelous short discussion. And we are going to put into the supporting materials the activities where you've made citations, as well as the work you've done in the 20 chapters of creating safe, equitable, engaging schools, and the science of learning and development, realizing the promise of every child. David, it's been delightful.